lives shaped by loneliness and pain. As Allison tries to leave her past behind in a new town, a chance encounter with an elderly man, Edward, opens the door to an unexpected friendship. But was it really just a coincidence? Surprises await them both, bringing new meaning to their lives. Why did Allison and Edward's paths cross? In this heartfelt and emotional story, discover the power of friendship, loss, and second chances. Allison, a 35-year-old divorced teacher, had left her city to escape one of the toughest periods of her life and settled in a small, quiet town. Adjusting to her new life hadn't been easy, but she had quickly adapted to the peaceful rhythm of the town. Having grown up an orphan, Allison lost her family at a young age and spent her childhood in foster care. During those difficult years, her supportive and inspiring teachers gave her the hope she desperately needed. Grateful for their kindness, Allison had vowed to become a teacher like them one day. She worked hard to achieve that dream and now was a dedicated teacher, passionate about her profession. She had met her ex-husband at work. They fell in love and married with high hopes. But over time, disagreements and unresolved issues wore down their relationship. After the divorce, continuing to work at the same school had become a daily source of pain for Allison. Summoning her courage, she decided to leave her past behind, move to a different town and continue her career there. She had only recently moved. The change was both challenging and exciting, offering her a chance to stand on her own and reshape her life. Yet that morning, New Year's Day, she felt a tinge of sadness. This New Year's, like every year, had been lonely. No gifts, no gatherings, none of those things were part of Allison's life. In her quiet, empty apartment, she found herself facing the first day of the year alone. Outside, snowflakes gently fell, while inside, Allison's solitude felt heavy and unshakable. Despite her determination to make a fresh start, her vulnerability and the shadow of her past lingered. With a cup of coffee in hand, she stood by the window, listening to the laughter of children playing outside. Taking a deep breath, she murmured, "Maybe this new year is my chance to change everything. But how?" Even she didn't know the answer yet. Allison grabbed her bag and headed out for a walk. Wandering through the snow-covered streets of the town seemed like a much better idea than staying cooped up at home. She planned to pick up a few things from the market and maybe get to know the town a bit better. As the snow fell gently, the streets were alive with a peaceful energy. Children laughed as they played snowball fights, while parents stood nearby, holding warm drinks and watching them fondly. Allison took in the serene scene with a deep breath. Just then, she noticed an elderly man sitting alone on a bench at the corner of the park. He sat motionless, his empty gaze and expressionless face seemingly unbothered by the cold. While everyone else spent time with loved ones, his solitude tugged at Allison's heart. Still, not wanting to intrude, she continued her way to the market. After getting what she needed and lingering a bit, she decided to take a longer route home. On her way back, she saw the old man still sitting on the same bench, and a wave of unease washed over her. The urge to approach him grew stronger. Finally, summoning her courage, she walked over. "Hi, I'm Allison," she said warmly. "I just moved here. How are you?" The man lifted his head and smiled faintly. "Ah, welcome," he replied kindly. "It's a nice place. My name's Edward." Allison sat down beside him and hesitantly said, "I noticed you've been sitting here alone since this morning. What are you doing out here?" Edward smiled sadly. "I couldn't stay at home," he said slowly. "The house has never felt so quiet on New Year's Day." Allison guessed he had suffered a great loss. "I'm so sorry." "What happened?" she asked gently, her voice soft and cautious. Edward took a deep breath. "I lost my wife this year," he said. "We never had children. It was just the two of us. This is my first New Year alone." When Edward's eyes filled with tears, Allison's heart ached. She knew loneliness well, but she couldn't imagine the depth of Edward's grief. He sighed quietly and added, "I just couldn't bear to stay inside. I've been sitting here watching the children and the people all day." Allison slowly reached out and touched Edward's hand. "I'm so sorry," she said sincerely. His hands were ice cold from the winter air. Edward nodded and offered a faint smile. "Thank you," he said. "Life goes on. I suppose this is just another part of it, isn't it?" In Edward's eyes, Allison saw deep sorrow, but beneath it, a quiet resilience. They sat together in silence, the cold winter wind a silent witness to their shared loneliness. Yet, in this brief, heartfelt conversation, they both found a small measure of comfort. Allison figured Edward was not only cold but also hungry. Her eyes drifted toward the small cafe across the street. "Nice to meet you, Edward," she said before walking away, though she knew deep down that he wouldn't head home anytime soon. Entering the cafe, she ordered 2 hot coffees, 2 croissants, and a gingerbread cookie specially made for New Year's. When she returned to the park, Edward smiled slightly and said, "You again?" Allison chuckled, "Well, you're the one still sitting here." They both laughed softly. Handing him a coffee, Allison said, "You're freezing out here, but I can't exactly drag you home. This should warm you up a little." Edward looked at her, surprised and touched, before taking the coffee and thanking her. Allison sat beside him, pulled out the croissants and placed one on his lap while she started nibbling on hers. "This is amazing," she said, taking another bite. "So delicious." Edward smiled. "That cafe's been around for ages. It's a family business, they're brilliant bakers. It's run by a young man named Daniel now. He's very talented." "How sweet," Allison said. "Sounds like baking runs in the family." Edward nodded as he sipped his coffee. "Yes, they're truly wonderful people. You'll grow to love this place." Their conversation deepened, and Allison noticed that Edward seemed more engaged and cheerful. She felt a quiet relief, knowing that their companionship was easing both his loneliness and her own. As the evening grew colder, Edward pointed to a snowman the children had built and joked, "We should head out before we end up like that guy." Allison laughed. "True, but this doesn't really count as a proper meal. Let me cook you something warm. My apartment's just nearby." Edward hesitated but couldn't resist her insistence and accepted the offer. Allison prepared vegetable soup and chicken. While the food simmered, they opened up to each other about their struggles. Allison shared her story, and Edward revealed the depth of his loss and isolation. If this story touched your heart and you'd like to hear more emotional, heartwarming tales, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Make sure to hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our new content. When they finished their meal and it was time for Edward to leave, he took a deep breath and said gratefully, "Thank you truly." The sorrow on his face hadn't disappeared. Allison wondered if Edward had noticed the New Year's cookie she had secretly slipped into his coat pocket as he walked home. When he slipped his hands into his pockets, he found an unexpected surprise, a small, elegantly wrapped cookie. Just as the familiar wave of sadness threatened to return, the thoughtful gesture brought a smile to his face. At home, Edward found himself thinking about Allison. The warmth and resilience of this young woman, who had endured so much pain yet remained kind and strong, had left a mark on him. Lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling, he whispered a quiet prayer. "Some things aren't coincidences, are they? You sent her here, didn't you?" That night, he fell into a peaceful sleep. The next day, after a long day at school with her new students, Allison spotted Edward from her window. She quickly went out to greet him. Edward began with a smile, "Thanks for the cookie." Allison grinned and they started walking together. "Let me thank you for your kindness yesterday," Edward said. Allison chuckled. "Kindness? I was lonely too. Spending time with you helped me as much as it helped you." Edward gave her a serious look. "I know you're lonely. No one deserves to be alone," he said. Allison paused, unsure how to respond to such a candid comment. "Fair enough," she said finally. With a teasing smile, Edward added, "But you should make some friends, someone other than a lonely old man like me." Laughing, Allison replied, "Oh, so you've got a plan to get rid of me, huh?" Edward shook his head with a grin. "Talking to you is impossible," he said, and they both burst out laughing. Later, Edward invited Allison to dinner, and she reluctantly agreed. But when she arrived at the restaurant, she was surprised to see another guest, Daniel, the young baker. Leaning toward Edward, she whispered, "Are you matchmaking now?" Edward chuckled. "Not at all. Just thought you two might get along," he replied with a wink. Throughout the meal, Allison and Daniel chatted and found they had a lot in common. Daniel, like Allison, was divorced and lived alone while running his family's bakery. Edward's plan seemed to be a good start for both of them. After dinner, Allison and Daniel walked together, while Edward headed toward his home in the opposite direction. Watching them, he smiled softly. "They've found each other," he thought. Looking up at the sky, he murmured quietly, "You came for me too, didn't you, my dear Amelia? My love, my friend. I miss you every day, but I'm so grateful for the days we had together. What if I'd never found you? Everything is part of life." The next morning, Edward's doorbell rang. When he opened it, no one was there. Looking down, he saw a cookie package on the doorstep. Smiling, he called out, "Come on out, Allison." Allison peeked out from behind the door, giggling. "What are you up to?" she asked playfully. Edward shrugged. "Nothing." Laughing, Allison said, "Well then, will you come to the movies with me? After all, you're my friend." As Edward grabbed his coat, he muttered, A friend, huh? What have I gotten myself into? Allison hooked her arm through his and started talking about Daniel as they walked. As they strolled and talked, both of them realized they weren't alone anymore. This newfound friendship had opened the door to a fresh start for them both. As Allison and Edward walked together through the snowy streets of the town, they both felt how their companionship had grown into a deep and meaningful bond. For Allison, Daniel had become a new beacon of hope, while Edward had found a friend to share his solitude. That evening, Allison stood by her window, gazing at the starlit sky. The stars shimmered peacefully over the town, and a sense of deep gratitude filled her heart. The pain she had carried for years was slowly easing, thanks to the new friendship she had formed. With a cup of tea in hand, she settled by the window, her thoughts drifting to Edward and Daniel. Despite the challenges of starting anew, she felt certain she was on the right path. Meanwhile, Edward sat at home, dipping another cookie Allison had left him into his tea, a gentle smile on his face. Life is full of surprises, he thought. Once again he silently thanked his late wife, whose memory had led him to Allison. An entire year had flown by and the new year had arrived. During that time Allison and Daniel had grown even closer, becoming a wonderful couple. Under the same roof they were building a peaceful life together. As Allison busily prepared the New Year's dinner in the kitchen, the doorbell rang. She didn't need to guess who it was. Standing behind the door was Edward, his warm smile lighting up his face. This New Year's celebration was special enough to mark the start of a new tradition: gathering and exchanging gifts. Edward stepped inside, holding a small, neatly wrapped box. "Every moment of this year has been more meaningful with you too," he said sincerely. Allison and Daniel welcomed him warmly, and they all gathered around the dining table. Laughter and heartfelt conversations filled the air during the meal. As Allison brought out the dessert, her eyes sparkled with joy. Daniel raised his glass and said, "This year hasn't just been a new beginning, it's brought us a new family." That night was more than just a New Year's celebration for Allison, Daniel, and Edward. It was a toast to a new chapter filled with hope and connection. Though the scars of the past lingered, they knew they were no longer alone. For each of them, the new year promised brighter, love-filled days ahead. If you enjoyed Allison and Edward's heartfelt story, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. For more stories, be sure to subscribe, and if you'd like to support us, consider contributing with a super thanks. Looking forward to sharing many more stories together.